All right, so we are now on chapter 9 of Thomas Pynchon's V, right at just about the halfway point of the novel. This one's called Mondaugen's Story. And so we had seen last time how Stenzel had heard a story from Mondaugen, and he's now currently telling that story to the soul dentist, Dudley Eigenvalue. And so chapter 9, which is another very long chapter, another kind of miniature novel about V, is what follows, and it's broken down into four subcomponents with four Roman numerals. Now this is set in Southwest Africa in 1922, but it goes back and forth in between 1922 and 1904, and also, though it does have V in it, and her name here is Vera Meroving, but Pynchon goes to lengths to show that it is the same person as Victoria Wren. She has a conversation with Hugh Godolphin again, for instance. 1922, but there are, chronologically, there are two other V chapters that take place before it. Chapter 14, which is set in 1913 in Paris, which is called V in Love. And then the epilogue is set on Malta in 1919, and there she appears as Veronica Manganese. And then, that would bring us to 1922, and then there would be then only one other chapter which takes place after it, namely chapter 11, which takes place again on Malta in 1943, in which we find her meeting her end. So the story opens up with, now, the setting here, the 1904 setting, and the reason why it sort of fades in and out between 1922 and 1904 is that in 1904, the Germans rather, had set up a colony in Southwest Africa as far back as I think 1883, and they had set this up, it's present-day Namibia, and by 1904, the Herero tribesmen had stimulated, their mistreatment of the Herero tribesmen had stimulated an uprising, and the Herero massacred a group of Germans, and the Kaiser brought in the dreaded Lothar von Trotha, who had a history with the Boxer Rebellion and with suppression of an Arab revolt in East Africa. So they brought him in, and he proceeded then to perform genocide and ethnic cleansing on the Herero, and simply declared that any of them that were found within German borders were to be shot or put in chains and sent out into the desert to die. And so Pynchon goes back and forth between 1922 and the fear of a Bondelsfort uprising that may reactivate, one character hopes that it will, Foppel, whom we'll meet in a moment, reactivate the glory days of German genocide all over again. So as the story opens up, then Mondaugen is a young 20-ish-year-old engineering student. And this reminds one of Hans Castorp at the beginning of Thomas Mann's novel, his 1924 novel, The Magic Mountain, where at the beginning of that, Hans Castorp is a young engineer, a naval engineer, who goes up the mountain in Switzerland to a sanatorium there where he stays for 7 years. So it's a bit evocative of that. And see, he goes and he's talking to one of the local administrators, who warns him that a siege is going on, and it might be 1904 all over again. The Bondelsforts are uprising, and you would do well to head up to Foppel's castle or villa and stay there during the siege. And Mondaugen takes this advice. He has been stationed to Southwest Africa to test something called spherics, which is something to do with, he's picking up radio signals and mapping them latitudinally and trying to figure out what the signals might mean. And so he's got various places of operation, but as long as there's a generator, and Foppel has a generator, then he can set it up anywhere. So then he moves on to Foppel's villa, where the first character that he encounters is Vera Meroving. He sees her he's working on the roof with one of his antennas, and he sees her down through a window, putting in her left eye. So by this point, she has an artificial left eye. She's begun her descent into the inanimate. She has an artificial left eye, and then when he goes down to meet her, he sees that the eye has a clock face with a zodiac, a miniature zodiac around it, which is really interesting. Now her name now is Vera Meroving. Vera means faith, And Meroving suggests the Merovingian dynasty of the 6th century in Gaul, which was a time of constant barbarian warfare. It was a very unstable period, and suggests a comparison of what's going on here in German Southwest Africa with that period of instability and chaos. And so he meets her. She says her name is Vera Meroving. She's a bit seductive with him. She's about 42, though, by this point. This is 25 years later past the last time we met her in 1899. And so he's here, and then he discovers inside Foppel's villa is a planetarium in there that can be operated by running on a sort of treadmill to turn the gears, which he does. And there's this young blonde girl in there. Pynchon doesn't say how old she is. Undoubtedly teenage-ish, named Hedwig Vogelsang, who teases him and flirts with him, and he runs after her. Doesn't get anywhere with her, at least not at first. But then he encounters Foppel, and he sees Foppel sadistically whipping a bundle. Foppel is fond of being very sadistic with the bundles and whipping them to death. Then he also sees in another room that Vera is there with her boyfriend, a guy named Lieutenant Weissmann, and they have an S&M relationship. He spies on them and sees her hitting Weissmann with a riding crop, a so-called sandbach, and him pulling on her hair. And so he sees this scene. And then really, V plays a very minor role, as actually she usually does. As we've seen so far, she always is peripheral to the center of the action. Her participation in the action isn't required. It's her presence that matters, because she is the muse of the West who is declining into the inanimate. And there's just one main scene with her to establish for certain that she is indeed Victoria Wren. Namely, we find that Hugh Godolphin, good old Hugh Godolphin, is here, the explorer, the Antarctic explorer that we saw last time, is here, and she's having a conversation with him. This is 25 years later, and now Hugh is in his 70s. I guess he had been in his 50s during the 1899 Vihaisu discussion, and they reminisce on the good old days 25 years earlier when they had last encountered each other in Florence, and she reminds him that he had told her about Vihaisu. He's like, did I tell you about Vihaisu? And she's like, oh yes, you most certainly did. And so they have this conversation. It's very brief, and it really serves only to establish the fact that this Vera Meroving is Victoria Wren. So then there's that. And so then those are the characters that appear circling around Mondagen, and they're all decadent and various states of debauchery. And this siege party, there's a party going on at Foppel's. They're constantly getting drunk, pursuing women, raping the local women. Goes on for 2.5 months. So he's here into July, I think, of 1922. And then, as Mondagen is working on his spherics, trying to decode the messages, if there are any, in this atmospheric noise that he's picking up, it sort of fades in and out. I think he gets scurvy at one point, and he starts having these hallucinations where the point of view, Pynchon puts us in the point of view of a generic person. We don't know who. He's just referred to as he, taking place in the 1904 Herero ethnic cleansing. And so Pynchon gives us some vivid accounts taken from original source material from a 1918 source book of accounts of the atrocities of the way that the Germans treated the Herero population as a kind of forerunner to the way they will later treat the Jews during World War II. And they treat them as objects of the inanimate. They're basically things. They're objects that you can do anything you want with. And so this is the way Pynchon portrays the German attitude to the Hereros in Southwest Africa. They are seen by the Germans as inanimate objects that you can do anything you want with. And this kind of thinking will lead on then into the atrocities of the 20th century, into all the various ethnic cleansings, not just of the Germans, but all over the place. Stalin and so forth. So the descent into the inanimate here by 1922 is pretty clear that where Western civilization is headed. And then the chapter ends with Mondagen going in and out of this sort of hallucinatory state, imagining 1904, and it flipping back and forth between 1904 and 1922. And then there's, in the last section, the subsection 4, There's a bit of violence with a Bundeswehr, a bit of an uprising, but it doesn't amount to much. They bring in a couple of biplanes and throw a couple of bombs down at them, and that pretty much ends it. And then Weissmann has been trying to bother Mondaugen and get information about his spirits. He's convinced that Mondaugen might be a traitor or might be getting access to information that he shouldn't. And so he finally comes to him and he says, I've translated one of your messages. And it says, the remainder of the message, Weissmann continued, now reads, Die Welt ist alles, was der Fall ist. The world is everything that is the case, which is, of course, the first line of Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. The world is everything that is the case, which is a treatise in which Wittgenstein comes to the rather sad and depressing conclusion that the world is just a collection of facts and that there is no transcendence to it at all. We're stuck with the brute factuality of things. But there is a kind of play here, too. The world is everything that is the case. As with Pynchon, there's always wordplay. That the world is everything that is the case surrounding it, the way, let's say, a printing press is made up of a case on the inside of which the type has been set. The world is everything that is in the case, that is the case, and it brings into question the way we frame the world. The world is everything that is the way it is epistemologically and philosophically framed. So there's a kind of joke, and that becomes the last sort of startling insight of the chapter, is the reduction of poor Mondaugen's spherics to the first line of Wittgenstein's very dry Tractatus. And there is a kind of McLuhan-esque aspect to this chapter too, in the sense that McLuhan had this idea that media could be broken down into hot media versus cool media. Hot media are things in which there is minimal participation and maximization of the medium itself, and that the more the person interacting with the medium interacts with it, the cooler it gets. So he says that print is, of course, the hottest of all media, since you're basically listening to a lecture, only it's in print. Radio also, he says, and cinema are hot forms of media, whereas forms of media like television and comic books are very low res and require a high degree of participation. They're cool media, so they require a much higher degree of participation. They require what McLuhan calls fill-in on the part of the participant. But he also has this idea that when cultures introduce hot media, such as print or radio, into cool cultures, that is to say tribal cultures, it can have the effect of upsetting them and causing them to revolutionize, to perform rebellions and revolutions, and what we would call the end goal of which is to create nationality, to nationalize. And so hot media, and in this case the hot medium would be Mondaugen's spherics, which are introduced into this world. And I think McLuhan would say that it's a hot medium. And we get the upset with the tribal response to these hot media that destabilizes their culture and leads to the process of detribalization, which is the first stage that is necessary toward nationalization. You have to detribalize in order to nationalize. So a McLuhan-esque reading of this chapter is very possible. So that's it. So that's chapter 9 of V. I think it's one of the best written chapters of the book. And then next up, we'll get back with the whole sick crew and Benny Profane with V chapter 10.